This bread recipe uses a technique that requires only 15% of the energy otherwise necessary to develop a strong gluten network. What that means for us home bakers is that we can make deliciously soft dinner rolls by hand with a fraction of the effort of a normal recipe. But did I mention that these are mochi dinner rolls with a unique, mildly chewy texture? You have to try them to taste how good they are. Hey, Seraphin here, and today we continue with our exploration of new bread recipes to get a mochi texture, based on science, of course. As I've mentioned before, our special ingredient to get that mochi texture is tapioca starch. This is based on the original Japanese mochi donuts, or pondering donuts, where they mentioned using tapioca starch to get a uniquely chewy texture. Now, in my research on the science of tapioca starch in bread, I came across a lot of research from Africa. You see, tapioca starch is made from the cassava plant, which is one of the most important crops in Africa. On the other hand, wheat is a crop that is imported in several African countries, making it expensive to use. With bread consumption on the rise, one country estimated that they would be able to save $252 million annually if they managed to substitute 40% of the wheat flour in a bread recipe with cassava flour. Reading about this makes me immediately think about what's going on in Japan, where people are eating more bread than rice, causing a surplus of leftover rice every year. This resulted in a push for ways to incorporate rice into bread. It seems like the same thing is happening in certain African countries, except that it's cassava now, not rice. Now, a lot of these papers are focused on cassava flour, not exactly tapioca or cassava starch. Cassava flour is made from the entire cassava root, while tapioca starch is made only from the starchy part, as I said just now. It's not apples to apples, so to speak. With that being said, the method that this paper uses to make high-quality cassava flour sounds extremely similar to how the tapioca we use is made, which is why we're referencing it here for a look at the science of the bread. So the study found that a mixture of 80% of wheat flour combined with 20% cassava flour produced bread that was generally accepted by a sensory panel in a way that compared to 100% wheat bread. That number is very close to what we found to be the best amount of tapioca starch for this bread, which is around 23%. I will also note that since cassava flour typically contains more fiber from other parts of the root tubers, it typically has more thickening ability, which is why it makes a lot of sense for us to raise the amount of tapioca starch by a bit to match the thickening ability of the cassava flour. In a pretty interesting result, this study also found that the cassava bread had a higher microbial load. In other words, they found that all samples of bread made with cassava flour had higher amounts of bacteria and fungi than the 100% wheat bread. Because of this, the study stated that these cassava breads may have a shorter shelf life than the 100% wheat bread. The reason for this higher amount of microbes was attributed to the fact that the cassava breads were all higher in pH and moisture content than the wheat breads, and they also had a lower alkaloid content. Here, I do want to say again, this was for cassava flour, not tapioca starch. And I will also note that while the fermentation time was not mentioned in the paper, it is very likely that we are fermenting our bread for longer than they did in the study, resulting in our bread dough becoming more acidic. So how much these results actually translate to bread we make at home or the many breads and products commercially made with tapioca starch and cassava flour is a bit shaky. Personally and subjectively, I live in a hot, humid climate, and this bread has lasted a good while for me, as long as I eat it in a few days. But of course, this is subjective. Now, when using tapioca starch, practically, there are a few things we need to pay attention to. One of the first things you'll find is that tapioca starch clumps up pretty easily, and if you're not careful when adding it to the bread dough, you might find that it makes little hard lumps like this. These are very difficult to get rid of, and they can ruin the appearance of the bread. The way to avoid these clumps is by making the tapioca into a slurry first before adding it to the dough. You may also want to consider sieving the tapioca starch if you live in a humid climate like us, because tapioca starch is hydrophilic. It loves water and absorbs it very quickly, which can result in lumps forming during storage. In our initial experiments to make bread with tapioca starch, we considered adding the starch to the Tangzhong so it could hold on to some of the water and improve dough consistency. But given the relatively high gelatinization temperature of tapioca starch, we didn't think it was a good idea because it resulted in a more inconvenient process of making tangzhong. As a result of that, the tapioca starch was added to the main dough. After the tapioca is inside the bread dough, given that tapioca starch doesn't have any gluten, being a starch, it's not really going to contribute to the structure that holds the dough together. And in fact, it's actually competing with the proteins for water. As a consequence of that, the dough requires extra water. More water and less structure results in a relatively wet and tacky dough. While for other recipes, this could be a severe downside because of the loose and wet dough, but for this recipe, this is actually pretty okay. Dinner rolls are very relaxed in terms of shaping, and the higher hydration allows us to take an easier approach to making the bread dough. With this hydration, it enables us to build the gluten network using a technique called lamination. If you've made artisan bread with no-knead techniques, you're probably familiar with this way of building gluten. Science-wise, it's actually really cool because this way of developing gluten requires only 15% of the energy otherwise necessary. What this means for us home bakers is a much more convenient process because we don't need to do any heavy kneading or mixing. This method is really similar to stretch and folds, and it's actually normally paired with 1 to 2 rounds of them. But this time I decided to streamline the process to suit the use of instant yeast and skip stretch and folds entirely in favor of 2 lamination steps. This way we could develop gluten at a very quick and efficient pace. With that being said, though, we still do need about 20 minutes between laminations for the dough to relax. So for this recipe, we're also lowering the amount of yeast from our regular 1% baker's percentage. We expect the yeast to multiply during the entire bulk fermentation. Though the timing for this recipe can vary based on your room temperature, so you want to try to proceed based on how the dough looks for the most part. All right, with that out of the way, let's jump straight in. Okay, these are the rolls we're making. Here's the recipe. All the ingredients and their amounts are listed here. Compared to the cinnamon roll recipe, we have lowered the amount of tapioca starch by a bit and increased the wheat flour. This results in a fluffier and slightly less chewy texture, more suitable for dinner rolls. The hydration of the bread is also slightly lower, which plays a part as well. I will say that while this is a quick recipe, I do make the tangzhong the night before making the main dough. You don't have to do this because this is already flavorful bread with sugar and butter. You could just make the tangzhong right before making the main dough. Just make sure to let it cool. Leaving the tangzhong overnight does give the best results though, so I do recommend it if you have time. Right, our first step then is to make the tangzhong. All we need is the flour and water. I usually have the flour already measured, and then we pour the boiling hot water into a bowl on top of a scale. Be very careful here, it's very hot. Right after the water is in, we want to toss in the flour and mix it immediately with a spatula. It's a race against time here. The starch inside the wheat flour completely gelatinizes at 65 degrees Celsius, so you want to make sure that the water is very hot when the flour is mixed into it. Most of the comments I receive about having problems with the tangzhong have something to do with this. If most of the starch granules are not gelatinized due to insufficient heat from the water, the starch won't hold on to as much water, and that can cause various discrepancies in the recipe, such as the dough becoming very sticky. Now we just continue mixing until we see all of the loose flour combined in the water. When the tangzhong looks like this, we've completed making it, and we can set it aside to cool to room temperature. Here, I'll be placing it in the fridge right after because I plan to make the bread the day after. So if you're making the tangzhong on the same day as the dough, then just let it cool and use it immediately. Next, we move on to making the bread dough. Here we have all of our ingredients prepared, mise en place, with a large mixing bowl in the center. For this recipe, during mixing, to prevent the tapioca from forming clumps, we're going to mix it with the liquids to make a slurry first, as we mentioned before. So we start by adding the milk, pouring it in, and then the water, followed by 1 whole egg, then we add the tapioca flour, and we want to mix this with the spatula to form a slurry. We just use the spatula to go around the bowl, breaking up any lumps that we see. We absolutely don't want to taste any lumps of tapioca inside our bread, even if tapioca is relatively flavorless. Lumps from the tapioca flour was actually my biggest problem during the development of this recipe. I tried multiple methods to mix in the tapioca starch without creating lumps. In the end, sieving the flour properly and then making it into a slurry was the best path I found to lumpless bread. Okay, when it's a neat slurry like this, we add sugar and salt, tapping them into the bowl. We follow that with the Tangzhong using the spatula. Then wheat flour, and finally yeast on top of the flour. This is to help the instant yeast survive rehydration, so make sure to follow this step if you're using instant yeast. We'll briefly combine all the ingredients using the spatula to create a shaggy mix. After that, we clean off the spatula with a scraper, getting both sides, and we want to mix the entire dough together for about 3 to 4 minutes by hand. This should get some of the gluten network forming, and more importantly, it should ensure that all the ingredients are well mixed. We can do some kneading motions super quick. Just make sure to bring everything together. When the dough is nice and even and it has a bit of strength to it, we add in the butter, and we're going to mix it in. The dough will come apart at first as the butter gets in between the gluten, but after we work at it for 2 to 3 minutes, the dough will eventually absorb the butter. Once the dough has absorbed the butter and looks very well mixed, we're done with all the mixing we need to do. Remember, we will be developing the gluten through laminations, so we'll clean off our hands, cover the bowl, and leave the dough to relax for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, we're going to uncover the bowl, and I'm going to walk you through how to laminate your bread dough. So I have a spray bottle here, and I'm just wetting the work surface. Any way you do this is fine. You don't need a spray bottle. We also have a bowl of water on the side to dip our hands into, which we'll do before taking out the dough with our scraper. The purpose of the water is to prevent sticking. That's why you want to dip your hands into the bowl as necessary. And now we're going to stretch the dough out into a nice and wide rectangle. We are not aiming to rip the dough, so we're working really gently and stretching it out bit by bit. Then when the dough is nice and wide, we're going to fold in the sides like this, before folding in the bottom and top in this order. Finally, we use a scraper to scoop the dough up and place it back into the bowl. And we're done with our first lamination. We'll cover the bowl and let the dough rest for another 20 minutes. This will give the dough some time to relax so we can stretch it out again. When the dough has relaxed for 20 minutes, we're going to do the same steps that we did before. Uncovering the bowl, preparing the work surface by spraying a good amount of water. You want to cover it evenly, that way the dough doesn't stick anywhere. Then we get the dough out with our trusty scraper, placing it onto the work surface. We repeat what we did before, gently stretching the dough out. It's a lot more tense than just now, which is a sign that the gluten network has been well formed. That's a good thing. So we'll just quickly fold the dough up into a neat rectangular shape and put it back into the bowl. Now we're essentially done with the main gluten building steps, and we can leave the dough to rise to roughly double in size, which should take around 40 minutes for us here at 29 degrees Celsius. This timing depends on room temperature, so you want to make sure to adjust it to your specific conditions. While we wait for the dough to rise, we're going to take a minute to line our baking pan. We're using this one here, and we want to use a silicone brush just to cover it with a non-stick coating. You can, of course, use vegetable oil or butter. When that's done, set the pan aside, and we'll wait for the dough to finish rising. Okay. After the dough has doubled in size, we're going to uncover the bowl, and we want to start shaping the dough. Use a little bit of bread flour to dust the work surface and the top of the dough before you scoop it out onto the surface. This dough is pretty sticky, remember, use flour as needed to prevent sticking. Now, before we do anything, we're going to do one last set of folds like this. just to build a little more strength in the dough as well as degas it. These large bubbles are the enemy here, okay? We're trying to get a relatively even crumb. It's important to try to degas the dough as much as you can without destroying the dough. Then we're going to first weigh the entire dough before dividing it into 8 even pieces. The exact number you get here may vary a little bit depending on how you handled the dough, but each piece should weigh around 71 to 72 grams. We'll just work our way through the pieces, evening them out. To be honest, they'd still taste amazing even if they weren't all exactly the same size, but they look fantastic when they're properly divided and shaped. After we've divided the pieces, we're going to shape them. Using a sprinkling of flour here and there as needed, we take a piece and we want to kind of knead it for a bit to fully degas it, just like how I'm doing here. Then we want to round it into a nice and taut little ball. We'll set it aside when it looks nice and repeat the shaping on the other dough pieces. Degassing is crucial here so that we get as even a crumb as possible. When we degas a dough, we divide the air bubbles into smaller ones, which is what gives us a much more uniform and even crumb. You also don't have to be overly concerned with getting a perfectly round shape because during proofing, the dough will puff up and end up with a pretty round shape anyways. Okay, when we're finished shaping all the dough pieces, we're going to place them into our already lined baking pan. We just line them up like this, 2 rows of 4. With that done, we cover the pan and let the dough proof until it almost doubles in size, which took about 50 minutes at 29 degrees Celsius. While the dough rises, we're going to take some time to preheat the oven to 180 degrees Celsius. And once the dough and oven are ready, we can continue. So just before the dough goes into the oven, we're going to brush it with some egg wash. This is simply 1 egg mixed up, and we'll apply it to the dough with a silicone brush, making sure to coat the tops of the dough in an even layer. And to top the rolls off, improving their appearance and taste, we're going to stamp them with sesame seeds, going one by one. Then all that's left to do is bake the dough. We place it into the oven and we want to bake it on the bottom rack at 180 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes on bottom heat, and then we'll switch it to top and bottom heat, baking for another 10 to 15 minutes or until the rolls turn golden brown all over. Every oven is different, so make sure to adjust these settings to your oven. Then we are done. The dinner rolls are fresh out of the oven. We'll brush them with butter, making them a little shinier and also adding a bit of flavor. Who doesn't love some butter? The dinner rolls are super soft and so good. The mild chewy texture makes them ridiculously enjoyable to bite into, and the egg wash makes the top flavorful and flaky. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and bye!